This is a decision that will hugely, profoundly affect this country's future and how history looks back upon us and our engagement with Europe at this moment in time.
The majority of the members of parliament want to stay inside the European Union. Business wants to stay inside the European Union. Even Mr. Cameron wants to stay inside the European Union, but doesn't say so. But the numbers are telling that 60 or more % of the British people want to leave the European Union. How do you explain this gap?
Europe's going through a huge crisis at the moment. And whilst Europe appears to be failing, it's therefore very easy for people who are hostile to Europe here in Britain to say, well, it's all a failed project, it's going nowhere, why would we want to be part of it? But there are two things that we should always remember about this situation. The first is that this is what these people have been saying from the beginning, and Europe is still there, and in my view will come through this crisis eventually and get back on its feet again and prosper. And secondly, you should just know that no political party since Britain joined the European community, no political party has ever won an outright majority in a British election on a Eurosceptic platform. So it's true if you look at the opinion polls, it looks all very grim, but actually underneath, I think there is a residue of common sense that will see us through.
But how come nobody speaks up but you, like you did in your speech recently at Chatham House? Why nobody really speaks up and defends the European Union?
Part of the problem is that politicians, they're competing for votes. You're in a situation where the economy's in difficulty. There's this tremendous sort of pressure around the European issue. Politicians get worried that they're going to see themselves out of touch with public opinion. However, I think there are two very important groups of people who still understand why Europe is so important. The first is business, because business knows for Britain to get out of Europe would be crazy for us, it would damage our economy. And the second is that there's a whole generation of people who, in a very practical way, experience the benefits of the European Union. They can go and work in Europe, they go to Europe easily, they enjoy Europe. And I think, although the almost, I would call it venom against Europe at the moment is very strong, I still think it's not as deep as people believe, and I think it can be countered, but I agree with you, it has to be countered.
You said that getting out of the European Union would be bad for a business in Britain, but we spoke to a lot of people and they said, oh, European Union is holding us back. Once we're out, it would be much easier for us to do business in the emerging markets, in China, India, Brazil. Is that true?
One of the really important things is to knock down these illusions or delusions. One is that if we're out of Europe, China and India open up to us more. This is nonsense. And by the way, the UK at the present time is significantly behind, for example, Germany, but even actually France. In India, we're well behind many of the others in China. If we leave the European Union, we don't become more important to those countries, we become less important to them because we're then no longer a country that can be a base for investment into Europe. And we've taken ourselves out of the largest political and commercial union in the world. So this is just a delusion, and it's important we knock it down fast.
And nobody stops Germany from selling cars to China now.
Germany does extremely well in its export trade with China right now as part of the European Union. We definitely do better with China and India if we're in Europe. We do better economically and politically. And look, in a world in which a country like Britain or a country like France or Germany is medium-sized, let's say, and actually relatively small compared with the giants of China and India and years to come, other countries too. In those circumstances, for us to believe that we're going to be stronger, isolated out of this big commercial market right in our doorstep, I mean, it cannot withstand rational analysis. There's one other thing I think is very important. When people talk about Britain and its life outside the European Union, What they actually assume is that Britain can carry on enjoying all the benefits of the single market, but none of the obligations or responsibilities of being part of Europe. The rest of Europe is not going to say yes to such a proposition. Why should they? I mean, we wouldn't in respect of another country. And this idea we're going to become Norway or Switzerland, I mean, this is fantasy land. I mean, Norway has a sovereign fund that in the years to come will be virtually double the size of the Norwegian economy. We don't have that in the UK. And in respect of Switzerland, Switzerland has a very niche position in the world. If we want to try replicating that on a grand scale in the UK, I think we'll find it very hard indeed.
That's the thing I felt too when you talked to a lot of the so-called Eurosceptics, and you talked to them about the vision they're having. The strategic depth of it is not very deep. If you really go through the points, it's all, as you said, fantasy land. How come they're so successful with that vision publicly here?
Euroscepticism is popular in Britain for the same reasons that nationalism, a sort of narrow-minded type of nationalism, can be popular in anyone's politics. And it's because it's based on an appeal to emotion. In our case, it's based on an appeal to Britain's history, but it's got no reality for the 21st century, for Britain's place in the world today, and why we as a country, rather than being narrow-minded, have got to be open-minded to the world. And by the way, it's when we are that we do best, as with the Olympics, both in winning it and in staging it. We showed our country to be open to the world, to be engaged in the world, not to be narrow-minded, hankering after the past. So, look, this Euroscepticism, it's got many different components in it, one of which, by the way, is legitimate criticism of Europe. But insofar as it's based on a kind of emotional, I would almost say, sort of atavistic appeal to the past, I still think and believe that people who believe in a future for my country that is, in the spirit of the 21st century, I still think we can win that argument.
Which part of the points they're criticizing the Eurosceptics are correct? I mean,
look, in virtually any country in Europe, including those most attached to Europe, there will be a raft of perfectly legitimate criticisms. You can look at the European budget and debate very sensibly how it's spent. You can think there are more reforms that Europe should be making. I think there is a case for saying, Europe can integrate more at some levels, and at other levels, the principle of subsidiarity is really, really important. You push power down to the lowest possible level. So there are masses of criticism that you can make and reforms that should be made. But none of those dislodge the essential point that the rationale for Europe today in the 21st century is actually stronger, not weaker, than it's ever been before.
How so? Is it because recently, obviously, the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize, and there was a lot of talk about whether the European Union really helped, stabilizing the continent in Britain. There was this discussion. And is it still about peace, or is it about the rationale about something else right now?
The rationale for Europe today is not about peace, it's about power. For my father's generation that fought wars in Europe, the rationale for the European Union after the Second World War was about creating a peaceful Europe for the first time in centuries. But today it's different. Today the rationale, I think, is even stronger and more powerful. And it's about how can countries, even of the size of Germany or France or the UK, how can we exercise economic and political power in a world in which China and India have got well over 1 billion people in them, when countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Russia have got populations vastly in excess of the largest European nation, and when the world is changing in a way that is realigning economic output with population. In those circumstances, if you take not the next 2 years as your timetable, but the next 20 or 30, Europe, by coming together, can exercise power collectively in a way it cannot do individually. That's the rationale for Europe today, and it's as powerful for Britain as it is for Germany or France. The hardest thing for any country, psychologically, is to try and come to terms with its changing position in the world. Now, Britain, began the 20th century as the world's most powerful nation, arguably. We ended the 20th century with, obviously, the world having changed completely. In the 21st century, we are a medium-sized country, not a large landmass, but we have some great alliances. We've got an alliance with America, and we're part of the biggest commercial and political union in the world. For Britain, if it wants to remain a global power, it's got to exercise its influence in part in alliance with others. That's just a basic lesson of realpolitik. There's nothing to be afraid of in that. It's a huge opportunity for us. And with the English language, and the fact is we've got great British enterprise, art, culture, and so on. This is a world we can operate in, and operate in very successfully, but we can't do it by living in the past. We should honor our past, but you can't live in it. When countries live in their past, then they fail.
One thing we heard, which was very serious again and again and again, and which I sort of understood, was that people said, listen, the European Union is undemocratic. It can't, it's not just that people in Brussels decide what's going on here and they're unelected technocrats, bureaucrats. What do you say to that? Because that's what we heard a lot, and people are very passionate about that.
Look, the European Union is a unique creation in political history. Now, I don't think it will carry on being so. I think other regional groupings will grow up and are growing up now for very obvious and sensible geopolitical reasons. But as the European Union's grown, yes, of course, there's constantly a gap between the power of its institutions and the system of democracy, and we've got to look for ways of bridging that gap. But that's the sensible thing to do. If there's an issue to do with Europe's democracy, let's see how we resolve it. Let's not use it as an excuse to break up what has been so successful and what, by the way, once we're through this crisis, will be successful again. My biggest fear is that we repeat what was really the fundamental mistake of Britain towards Europe, which is that we didn't join at the outset. We didn't, for very similar reasons to the types of debates today, but we spent the next 2 decades trying to get in. I think if we take a step out of Europe today as a country, because Europe's going through all its difficulties, we'll be right back in the same position. There'll be a brief moment when it's okay, and then there'll be decades of trying to get back into a union we should never have left. So this is a moment where I think those of us who take that view should articulate it, and articulate it very strongly, and at least make people understand that this is a decision that will hugely, profoundly affect this country's future and how history looks back upon us and our engagement with Europe at this moment in time.